it's important that we mention these precedents. So you mentioned Amsterdam, and I'm sure you've been to Copenhagen as well. And you're right, it wasn't like that. It wasn't until Jan Gehl in Copenhagen actually worked together with the government agencies and sort of said, well, look, let's adjust the thinking, the culture of using the car versus the culture of walking and cycling. So now, as you say, in Copenhagen, 50% of people that are walking, that are going to school or to work, are walking or cycling. And it's remarkable. You walk around that city and it's quite calming as a pedestrian because there's only half the number of cars and you can sense that it's the bikes and the pedestrians that have got pride of place.
Hi, Smart Community friends, and welcome to Mobility March. This month, I have some great episodes for you all about the theme of mobility. In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I have a great chat with Mike Day from Integrated Planning, Design and Placemaking Practice, Hatch RobertsDay. Mike tells us about his background in town planning and why he is so passionate about shaping neighbourhoods and making better places for humans and nature. We recorded this episode right at the end of 2022, so when he says next year, he means right now in 2023. We have a great discussion about his aversion to the term smart and the importance of long-term thinking in building sustainable, connected and livable cities. Mike shares a great example of this regarding putting in a new train line to a new suburb and how some governments may not do this because they're caught up in short-term thinking. Mike and I explore how we can make more accessible neighbourhoods that privilege the transport modes of walking and cycling over cars, and why it's town planning and design to blame for our current car dependence. We talk about the decline of kids walking to school and the importance of planning places and cities for children. Mike then tells us a bit about the history of Copenhagen's intentional creation of a culture of active transport and what we can learn from precedents like this. We finish our chat discussing the emerging trend of the distributed or hybrid workplace, the future of mobility in our neighbourhoods, plus the new dual mandate for transport departments of both movement and place. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Mike. How are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you, Zoe. Pleasure to be with you today.
Yeah, I'm excited to have this discussion today. So let's just jump straight in. And can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
Okay, so Zoe, I studied town planning in Western Australia. At the time, it was the only planning course. And I was very, very fortunate in the early days of the time that I was studying to be employed by a woman by the name of Margaret Fielman. And Margaret was actually the first architect planner in Perth. And there's a fascinating background to Margaret. And it was the thing that I think that really inspired me. I had a geography teacher, obviously, that was the inspiration for me to start the planning course. But it was really Margaret Fielman who sort of instilled that and sort of maintained that passion for town planning. And the reason being was that Margaret, but it was just back in the 1950s. So Margaret was an architect, but she went to Durham in England and studied town and country planning and came back to Western Australia, and she won the contract to design a new town called Kwinana. So it was just inland from the Kwinana industrial area. That BP had just built a new refinery there. British Petroleum had built the new refinery, and the state government wanted to, obviously house the key workers. And so Margaret won the contract to design this new community. And so she set about doing that, and she laid out a wonderful, laid the foundation for a wonderful new community. It was very much about shaping neighbourhoods, and I think that's something that we've been steeped in, and I've been steeped in as I've worked through over the years. Is that we feel we're privileged to be able to do is to lay the foundation for community. We can't create community. But the other thing, I think there's a turn of phrase that Andreas Duane uses, who is one of the leaders of the urbanist movement in North America. And Andreas talks about, as a profession, of it being a reform movement rather than a professional advancement. A lot of, architects or engineers, it's continually about sort of advancing the engineering profession, whereas from as a planner, I think we're primarily dedicated to making better places for humans and to safeguard nature. And if we continue to just remind ourselves of that, we realise just how privileged we are to sort of, as I say, lay the foundation for these communities. So inspired by Margaret, and interestingly, I worked in Margaret's firm back in the 1980s, just before she retired, and we set our practice up, RobertsDay, back in 93, Erwin Roberts and I. We think based on the ethos of what Margaret sort of adopted, and the couple of, I just wanted to share with you a couple of the things that were really dear to her heart. Firstly was she always collaborated. And when you're laying out these new communities, it's very important to work with other consultants, with the environmental consultants, with the economists, with the engineers, the surveyors, the architects, whatever. And interestingly, even though she was an architect and she went and studied town and country planning, when she came back to Western Australia, she maintained the architectural practice and the planning practice. And I said to her, Margaret, why did you never go back into architecture? She kept the architectural practice going, but she had such a passion for town planning. She stayed with the planning. She said, Mike, the reason being, I affect more people's lives when I lay out a new community than I do in a building. I thought that was fascinating. And I just continually sort of reflect on that when you look at, we've got a major new town that we've been shaping for the last 30 years in Perth called Ellenbrook. And every time I fly in and I look down and there's 20,000 people living there, and I think, how fortunate we are to sort of shape that environment that people will grow up in and be influenced by. So really, really important to us. So that's a little bit of background, I think, on, the passion that I've got for planning. I came to Melbourne about 15 years ago, and unfortunately, I don't see the same level of interest in the built form and design as I did in Western Australia. And that's something that I'm constantly trying to instill in all of our team and a lot of the planners that I deal with in Melbourne and Sydney, is that we've got these growth areas that we're planning in and around Sydney and Melbourne. And we really need to sort of reflect, I think, a lot of those timeless principles that are in the inner neighbourhoods.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think reflecting on our professions and why we chose our professions and having that impact on the community is so important. And I think as we move into the future as well, it's like how can we extend that impact? And I think collaboration is a huge part of that, thinking about how what you talked about is laying the foundations for community building is really exciting as well. So we'll talk about, I think, projects and things you've been doing in more detail shortly, but let's just go broad. And what is a smart community to you? Okay,
so Zoe, I'm not sure whether you're going to be too happy with my response to this, but I have got a little bit of an aversion to the notion of a smart community, right?
I love aversions. I love it. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, so a little bit of a different view than you and maybe some other people on this notion of a smart community. To me, it's a bit of a misnomer, like what is smart, right? Like what I prefer to refer to the work that we do as, timeless urbanism. And timeless urbanism, so it's really important for us to sort of reflect on what's happened in the past, but very conscious of the future. And one of the things that I think is the reason that we integrated with Hatch. So RobertsDay integrated with Hatch, the Canadian firm, which is an engineering firm that's now got a division called Urban Solutions. And the reason that Urban Solutions was set up as part of the Hatch entity out of Canada was that the CEO said, look, we might be entrepreneurial engineers, but we should be thinking about the future of cities 30 to 50 years out. Now, if that's what we mean by smart, well, that's fine. But I'd rather think about it as, the future. We often get referred by our clients as futurists, right? And I think that's a really important dimension of what a planner should be doing. It should be thinking about the future. Not 3 to 5 years, but 30 to 50 years. And as I said, we've got this project in Perth, Ellenbrook. We started in 93. The train's coming next year. I've had to wait 30 years for the rail to come to service that new community. We've probably got another 5 or 10 years to go on that project. So, 30, 40-year projects, they're a long time in gestation and incubation. So it's important that we think about the future. So rather than just smart, I think it's more about livable, connected, sustainable. There are more sort of apt terms, I think. One of the things I learnt too, in terms of what the future holds for us, is we spent some time at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They've got a division called the Media Lab, and within the Media Lab, they've got a group called City Science, and they're constantly looking at the future of cities. So I think it's really important that we do be mindful of technology and the future and the transitioning of these urban areas. And one of the things that the MIT, the guys at the lab were looking at, was this notion of mobility on demand. right? So the micro-mobility, mobility on demand. So we're seeing it now. We're seeing the electric bikes, the electric scooters, the electric skateboards, as an alternative, and really quite a sustainable alternative to everyone getting in a car. Not just more, it's more affordable, it's more sustainable, better for the planet. And, with these electric bikes, you still get as much exercise, but you go twice the distance as you would on a normal bike. So the only thing is we need dedicated paths for the bikes to be on as well as the pedestrians. So, look, to me, the smart city is more akin to what one of our clients, Nick Cleary, is doing. He's the chairman and the CEO of a group called CLARA, Consolidated Land and Rail Australia. And what we've just completed a business case for Nick and the federal government looking at the notion of a high-speed rail between Sydney and Melbourne. So can you imagine 1 hour and 58 between Sydney and Melbourne on a high-speed rail, and 8 new cities about the same size as Canberra? And so what that'll do is take the pressure off Sydney and Melbourne, purported to go from 5 million to 10 million. And look at the issues we've got with congestion and affordability in Sydney and Melbourne at the moment. So if we can build these new cities along a high-speed rail link so everyone's connected, that to me is smart planning. But I'd rather use the term, as Nick does, sustainable, connected and livable cities.
Yeah, I'll let you in the smart community space with that kind of definition. I agree. I think I used to, when I got into the space, it was smart city. I moved to smart community because to really bring that people side of things. But to me, the smart, I agree, it's not necessarily the best term, but it's the one that we use at the moment. And I don't mind it, to be honest. I know some people have an issue with it, but...
Well, it's recognisable. I agree. A lot of people recognise that we're trying to think about how we might be able to plan cities more creatively and innovatively.
Exactly. But also, to your point, it's not just about the technology and the data. Those things are really important. We need to be aware, like you were saying. And for me, they can't fall off because they're in our lives. We can make better decisions with them, but we need to use them as tools. There's unintended consequences, all that type of stuff as well. But the words that you used, livable, sustainable, and connected, are all words that we use in this space. And the other one I put in there is accessible. And so using the new ways of thinking and different ways of thinking, but also, like you said, that future thinking as well. Like planners are good at future thinking because you have to be, right? Because we know that things don't happen they might happen in 5-10 years, but also that 30-40-year vision as well. But then also not just waiting for that to happen. We know that we need to make decisions now. Like that rail line didn't come because someone made a decision yesterday. It was because someone made a decision 30 years ago that would be a good idea based on, all the things that we know.
So that's fascinating you pick up on that because that's one of the frustrations from our end. So when I put the master plan together, the structure plan for that Ellenbrook project, we embedded a 40-metre wide transit corridor right through the middle of the estate, right? And thinking that it might be 5-10 years. But it's interesting, we had 3 governments actually promised to build it, but then they reneged on it. And then finally, now they've started construction. It's coming next year. So 2023, 30 years after. And fortuitously, there's still quite a bit of land around the train station where we can do the mixing of the uses. We can do key worker housing, we can do mix up the uses. And then probably what I'd like to see is reduce the amount of parking. Because one of the problems, I'm not sure where you're based, if you're in Melbourne or Sydney.
I'm in Toowoomba in Queensland.
Toowoomba in Queensland. Excellent. I have spent some time in Toowoomba. It's a beautiful, up on the plateau there. It's a beautiful city. But one of the things that we're finding is that even in Melbourne, the government spent a significant amount of money, $4.8 billion on a regional rail link from Geelong to Melbourne, around through the growth areas, through Melton and Wyndham, and $4.8 billion, and we spent $50 million on each of the railway stations. But unlike a lot of the European cities or North America, we've got a good friend, Chris Lineberger in Washington, D.C., doing all this mixed use around the rail stations. What did we do on those rail stations? $50 million stations, 1,200 car bays. It's just so sad. And there's no urban form. We could have put key worker housing for the AMBOs, for the police, for the teachers, the nurses that unfortunately now they've got to move to Geelong because they can't afford to live in Melbourne.
Yeah, you're right. And it's like that connected piece, right? We need to think about that. Some big projects, for example, like major projects, okay, you've got your end, the train ends there, but then what are those links? Well, we're still people at the end of the day. We don't just teleport at the moment, maybe in the future. We don't just teleport to the train and get on it, right? But how do we make that a place? How do we make it livable? So it's not just a train station anymore, as you were saying. It's actually, yeah, you get on the train there, but you also do a whole bunch of other things, and you're linking it to that the place and where people live, and people want to be there because we've created places that are activated that people want to be. And I think and I'm going to Europe actually tomorrow, so I'm excited to get all vibed up again, but we need to shift our thinking in that space so then we do create those places.
Absolutely, Zoe. And the point that you used the term there, accessibility, I think that is fundamental, and it's central to everything that we do. And we always think about, as I said earlier, we're shaping the human habitat. And the original neighbourhood, my understanding is 5,000 years ago, the original neighbourhood was a place in Turkey called Pergamon. And the neighbourhood unit was actually dependent upon, mum hollering and calling the kids in, at night time for dinner. So that was the distance that a parent could call the kids in. And that was the sort of, the dimensions of the neighbourhood unit. And that was what fostered that community interaction. And the other thing that's really important to us too is every project that we're working on now was particularly in the growth areas, rather than just the suburban development. We always talk about sort of urbanising the burbs or creating a much more urban sort of environment akin to those inner neighbourhoods of it, where it might be Toowoomba, Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney. It's the inner neighbourhoods that are usually compact, connected and walkable, compact, connected, mixed use and walkable, and they're serviced by transit, right? And then what we talk about, and again, we learnt this from the guys at MIT, is the privileged and the preferred modes should be walking and cycling. And if we could just get into that mindset, and I just had a beautiful note from a client in Adelaide this morning, because I've been talking to him over the last few months about these electric bikes, and he's written back and said, Mike, I've just bought an electric bike and it's changed my life. I ride to work now. It takes me 26 minutes, 26 minutes to ride back home because it's very hilly, because he lives in the Adelaide Hills, but it's 18 minutes to get to work. And the other thing that we've found is that RACV and RACQ, interestingly, are saying it's between $12,000 and $20,000 a year to own and run a car, right? Now, that's, when you think about that and affordable housing, if we could sort of create a walkable neighbourhood and a cyclable neighbourhood, give everyone an electric bike at $3,000 to $5,000 rather than a car, we're saving them that $12,000 to $20,000, which is about $200,000 off the mortgage. So a $600,000 dwelling becomes $400,000. In terms of affordability. So it's all interconnected. But accessibility and those privileged modes, the walking and the cycling, we think are fundamental.
Absolutely. And I think what you've just spoken through there is that connectedness as well. It's not just about, mobility is not just about getting from A to B. It's how we move, like that example of, change my life. That commute, right? That can really shift and change your life, the way that you get places and how you can access things. Like, it's not just about, I need to go from here to here. It's accessing opportunities, it's services, healthcare, all those type of things as well. But then linking that in with health and well-being. And, I used to hate my commute. Honestly, I just could not. And it was what I felt like was my only choice kind of thing. And I used to hate it. Whereas now, like, I can shift things up, I can change things. But also, it's very different. And I think thinking about our commute differently is something. Like, our commute in the sense of like what we can access is really important, because like you were talking about there with where people can afford to live and those type of things, how can we then make them more livable so then people are able to access those things? I just think that there's so much in there that's so linked together and probably not making a lot of sense, because it is a bit of a spider web, right, of all these things that once that happens, then it's like this chain reaction, but you can't actually necessarily map out everything that it touches because it's so intertwined, I guess.
It is intertwined and it is complex, but you've touched on some really important matters there, right? So let's just reflect on this issue of commuting. I think it's like $6.5 billion a year is spent in commuting, like around the country. Because we've done a lot of research as part of this business case for the high-speed rail in these new cities, where it would take the pressure off people commuting. But the other thing is we're working closely with a good colleague, and this comes to one of the questions I think that you were putting to me a bit earlier, is who do we work with? The collaborators. We need to collaborate. You can't do it by yourself. It is complex. There's a lot of interrelated matters when you're shaping an urban place, right? And over such a long period of time. So there's a fellow by the name of Chris Lineberger. And so for your listeners, if they're interested, he's got a website, chrislineberger.com. But Chris is like a world authority on walkable urbanism and the transition of a lot of these places in Washington, D.C. and along the east coast of America that were suburban, very much car dependent. And I think as planners, we're at fault. So it's a legacy of the Industrial Revolution where we separated the houses from the satanic mills, right? But what's happened is the planning profession has relived that victory generation after generation after generation, to the point now where everything gets separated. You've got to drive to the business park, you drive to the shopping centre, you drive your kids to school. Interestingly, on that matter, I just made a comment on a post on LinkedIn by Victoria Walks, right? So Ben Rossiter and his team at Victoria Walks have just posted and spoken to the ABC about the problem that the residents have got just walking and cycling within these new communities. We're not putting footpaths in anymore. And an alien right of every kid should be to, from day one, to walk to school. And what we're saying is, Jennifer, I just posted an image, a graph that Jennifer Keysmat presented in a TED Talk a few years ago, and we've gone from 60% of kids walking and cycling to school to 12%. It's a complete inversion of that ability of kids walking and cycling to school. And what happens is when they do that, it's a completely different experience. There's this notion of having autonomy, being independent, and it's just so important. I think the kids have that level of independence and can get to these daily needs, get to school and get to the daily needs, without having to be ferried by their folks. And you've probably heard, I think, what happens is if one of your kids you're taking to school, you're driving to school for the life that they're in it, for the time that they're at school, as a parent, it's 3 years off your life. So you're wasting 3 years of your life driving your kids to school. The other thing that really saddens me is when I work around the country and I talk to parents and ask them why they won't let their kids walk and cycle to school, and it's for fear of other parents running them over. How crazy is that? In Scotland, in Canada, now you've got these towns where they're actually banning cars. So within 400 metres of the primary school, you've got to get out of your car and walk your kid to school.
Yeah. It's interesting also, I've had a few people on the podcast actually talking about this. Natasha, who talks about building cities for kids and that type of thing as well, and thinking about those kind of, prioritise routes and all that type of stuff as well for school kids. But also thinking about if we are walking, kids then are taking more note of their place, right? You're not just in a car, you're just, watching the world go by. You're actually walking, you're looking at the footpath, you're looking at the lighting, you're looking at the street furniture. You may not think about it, but it's actually creating more involved citizens because, they can report that whatever that's pothole in the pavement or whatever the case is, because you're actually involved in the community and building that out. And I think that's also just thinking about how we can not just, it's infrastructure, of course, but it's also awareness and normality, making it normal. That's the norm to walk and cycle to school. And we see in Europe, if you go to Amsterdam, for example, the norm is not to, jump in a car. The norm is to jump on a bike. But that wasn't always the case. People have said, we're not all Amsterdam, but they weren't Amsterdam either before they actually made that kind of solid choice to be able to do that and obviously invest and all that kind of stuff. It all leads into it. But I think if we start thinking a bit differently, we can start to, try those things that might be a little bit, new, but see what sticks and then how we can really create our communities around that.
So, Zoe, I think it's important that we mention these precedents. So you mentioned Amsterdam, and I'm sure you've been to Copenhagen as well. And you're right, it wasn't like that. It wasn't until Jan Gehl in Copenhagen actually worked together with the government agencies and sort of said, well, look, let's adjust the thinking, the culture of using the car versus the culture of walking and cycling. So now, as you say, in Copenhagen, 50% of people that are going to school or to work are walking or cycling. And it's remarkable. You walk around that city and it's quite calming as a pedestrian because there's only half the number of cars and you can sense that it's the bikes and the pedestrians that have got pride of place.
Mm. Yeah, it just makes me happy also. I don't know why, but just seeing bikes cycling around, I just felt so happy when I was in Amsterdam. And I was only in Copenhagen for a day, unfortunately, but I'm definitely going back, and I've had some people from Copenhagen on podcasts. Yeah, again, really calming, just cruising around. I'm like, oh, wow, it's quiet.
Makes you feel at ease. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Now, I'm just looking at the time because I know we want to wrap up. So we've talked not about specific projects, but you've given us some great fodder and some food for thought there. And we can put some links in the show notes if there's specific projects that you want people to go and have a look at and that type of thing. But if it's okay with you, we might zoom to the future now and talk about some future trends, in particular ones that people aren't talking about enough from your perspective.
Okay, so a couple of things. So we've been through the pandemic, right? Now, I'm not saying that we're finished with it, but we've been through the onslaught. And one of the things that we've been reflecting on is that we do believe that there is a silver lining to the COVID cloud. And the trends that we think are emerging are that people were getting out, they were walking, right? They were sort of contained to their neighbourhoods. So they were realising that if the daily needs are within walking distance, and this is where we had the haves and the have-nots, those that are in a lot of the inner neighbourhoods, the compact, connected, mixed-use, walkable, so that the parks were close, the local shops were close. And what was happening is a lot of people might be working from home, but they were going down to their coffee shop and they were meeting either people that they interacted with work, or they were actually, meeting with them in that sort of local context. The other thing that's happened, and I think is a future trend that's with us, is that this notion of CBDs, we've all heard the term CBD. It seems to be an Australian idiom, right? Central Business District. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, that what we're trying to do as a planning profession is move away from single uses. There's really no reason why the uses can't coexist. There's no more satanic mills. There are some heavy industry that needs to be, in a district, right? But most uses can coexist. The office above the residential or the commercial, we can mix them up, and there's ways and means of, noise attenuation or arresting odours, all that sort of stuff. So we've got to bring the uses back together. What happens then is it reduces the need for parking, because what they say is that for every car park, and we only use cars for 4% of the time, 96% of the time they're parked, right? And there's usually 6 car bays for every car, because they're, the different places that they're going to park. So mixing up those uses, but in the central city, we need to just abandon the term CBD. It should never be called Central Business District anymore, because not everyone's going to come back 5 days a week, and it's not going to just be a single use. We need to bring in culture and the arts and residential, more people living downtown. Call it a downtown or a central city, but not a central business district. A single use is a misnomer. And the corollary to that is, again, with our friend Chris Leinberger from Washington, D.C., Chris has penned a paper with Despina Katsakakis, who's an eminent expert on the future of the office and the future of workplace. They've penned a report for Cushman & Wakefield, it's a global scan, looking at the future of workplace. And they've coined the term distributed or hybrid workplace. So we've all heard about people working from home, but the other thing that we need to do is to think about working close to home. So when we're laying out these new communities, don't just put the shopping centre in there and the residential and the schools and the parks. We need to think about some workplace, right? And if the workplace is sort of in with all the daily needs, then people might get on a bike or they might be able to walk to those facilities. And the other thing too is if you're at home all the time, sometimes you do get cabin fever. Or if you're on top of the family, you just need that time away. But it's so debilitating. And I'm hearing of residents in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, they're commuting 2 and 3 hours a day. And as you say, it's not a happy time. It can be quite debilitating. Like the family unit breaks down because we talk about these vampire suburbs because people leave in the morning and they go back at night time. So they never get to see the light of day. So it's very important. I think that's a future trend. The other thing is this micro-mobility, is the way that we're going to get people to spend less time in the cars. I'm not saying we're going to get rid of cars, to spend less time in the cars, is that we're going to see the micro-mobility, right? So Monica Zaffaro is a friend and a colleague who's based up in Newcastle, and she's got a group called BICO, right? And so your listeners will be able to sort of hop onto her website. So BYKKO, BICO, it's a bike share, an electric bike share. So she's working with Newcastle City Council and the state government, and people can, dock these bikes and move around Newcastle without having to use the car. So that's another important trend, right? The other thing I think that's happening is that we are going to move towards autonomous vehicles, but hopefully they're going to be shared autonomous vehicles. And probably the best reference point, I think, for your listeners would be for me to give you the website, Clara. So clara.com.au. Clara.com.au is the Consolidated Land and Rail Australia. I think some of the research that's been done there is to think about 30, 50 years out, what is the future of cities? And as I said, it's that notion of sustainable, connected and livable cities. But imagine a high-speed rail, trackless trams are another technique, right, or another initiative and a measure that I think we're going to see introduced into cities. Now, these trackless trams are about a sixth or eighth of the cost of a standard tram. So if you can imagine the steel on steel that moves through, they've just put one into George Street and out to Randwick in Sydney. And unfortunately, that cost a lot of money because they didn't know where the services were under the streets. They spent $120 million a kilometre. Normal steel on steel tram is about $60 to $80 million a kilometre, whereas a trackless tram is about 6 to 8. So it's a tenth of the cost for these trackless trams. They're coming out of China. They're part of the advanced high-speed rail technology. They're very stable. They've got this incredible stabilisation, and they are autonomous. So there's very little movement on them. But the most important thing is, unlike buses, they enhance the streetscape. So particularly in Melbourne, we've got the largest street tram network in the world. But if you're sitting on a street in an inner neighbourhood in Melbourne, the tram goes by, it enhances the streetscape. Whereas the buses, They're very large, they're imposing, they're not human scale, they're often noisy, but they're an imposition in the streetscape. So that's where, personally, I'm a big fan of the trams and possibly these trackless trams into the future.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there, and then I think the future of mobility is something that we need to think more and more about, and not just mobility on its own, like you were talking about. It's actually about the place and the streetscape and the land uses and all that type of stuff as well. And we're seeing more and more of that.
That's important, and the good thing too is because one of the questions you did have for me, I know, was just the relationships we've got with the government agencies, right? And this is where the Department of Transport in both Victoria and New South Wales, I'm not sure about Queensland, but they've actually got a dual mandate now. It's movement and place, right? So they're giving equal weight to place as they are to movement. And in the past, I think what we've done is often we've created these traffic sewers where we're just trying to move the cars as quickly as possible. But, as a pedestrian or a cyclist, they're really hostile places to be in. So I think that's important. And then the other thing, I've got a lot of time for one of the senior government directors of the planning department in Victoria, James Mann. He's leading this. He's the head of the Director of Places and Precincts in Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning here. But he's got an initiative called 20-minute neighbourhoods, and he's really sort of promoting this. And it's important, I think, that as consultants and as the private sector, we need to work together with government, so both at state level and council level, to try and bring about some of these changes in the urban streetscape.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, Mike, it's been so great to chat with you. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think we need to definitely have some more because I think there's so much in that. And yeah, I really thank you for your time today. I think the listeners will really enjoy this one because we've obviously, we're talking about smart community or whatever, but how that actually links in with the places that we live, work and play is so key. So yeah, it's been really great to chat with you today.
Thank you, Zoe. And from my perspective, it's so important, I really appreciate the time and effort you make to sort of interview us because this is the way that we get the message out. It's very hard for us to sort of do it individually, but you're able to communicate it to a lot more people. And it's really important. It is a very noble profession, laying the foundation for community. And we really appreciate your assistance as well. And if people want to, get a bit of an appreciation of, my interests, probably best on LinkedIn or Twitter. So my handle on Twitter is @Walkplace. So @Walkplace on Twitter and just Mike Day on LinkedIn. And I do post quite a bit of material that I feel is really in keeping with our ethos and our values and philosophy.
Excellent. So people can click away and find you. We'll put all the links in the show notes. Thanks again for coming onto the podcast, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Pleasure. Thank you. Likewise, Zoe. Take care. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, Mike. Bye.
Are you looking for an engaging speaker, MC or facilitator for your next big event? Then we've got you covered. Zoe is a go-to speaker, MC and conversation facilitator with a difference. She's a master at simplifying the complex and making connections you might never see. Book Zoe for your next event. Email hello@mysmart.community or head over to her speaker page, www.mysmart.community/speaking.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.